Have you ever stopped to think about what is actually happening when you make a simple choice, like deciding what to eat for lunch? On the surface, it feels like you, as a conscious agent, are making a free decision. But if you talk to a hardline physicalist or a neuroscientist, they might tell you that your choice is nothing more than the inevitable result of lower-level neural firings, chemical reactions, and the laws of physics playing out in your brain. This tension between our lived experience of free will and the deterministic view of the physical sciences is one of the oldest debates in philosophy. But today, we are going to dive into a truly fascinating paper that attempts to bridge this gap in a highly original way. The paper is titled Mereological Emergentism and Agent-Causal Free Will by Dwayne Moore. It is a dense, rigorous piece of metaphysical philosophy, but what Moore is trying to do is build a framework where human agency is not just an illusion and yet it does not violate the laws of physics. He proposes an emergentist model of Agent-Causal Libertarianism. So, to really unpack this, we need to understand how Moore builds his argument from the ground up, starting with the very building blocks of nature.
Exactly. And to understand Moore's position, we cannot just jump straight into free will. We have to start exactly where he starts, which is by looking at nature as a layered mereological system. Mereology is just the philosophical study of parts and wholes. Moore asks us to look at how things combine. You start with lower-level parts, like hydrogen and oxygen atoms. These have their own intrinsic properties, and they can enter into binary relations with each other. When you gather a bunch of them together, you get a sum of parts, and if they are in the same space and time, you get a spatio-temporal relation. But Moore makes a crucial distinction here. Even if you have specific spatio-temporal configurations, which is his level 6 in this framework, you do not necessarily have anything emergent yet. For example, think about glucose and fructose. They are isomers. They have the exact same molecular components, carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, in the exact same space and time, but they have different spatio-temporal configurations. Or, think of a heap of bicycle parts. You have tires, gears, pedals, and a handlebar sitting in a pile. If you arrange them bicycle-wise, you have a new spatio-temporal configuration. But Moore points out that at this stage, this configuration still exists on the same mereological level as the parts themselves. It only has the causal powers of those lower-level parts arranged in a specific way. There are no novel causal powers yet. It is not an emergent substance.
Right, and that is where the pivot happens. Moore argues that to get actual emergence, you have to move to level 7, which he calls specific mereological configurations. These are what we would call higher-level wholes, or a novel substance. But if I am a skeptic, I might ask, why should we consider this higher-level whole to be a distinct substance from just a really complex spatio-temporal configuration of its parts? What makes a rabbit conceptually and ontologically different from just a highly organized arrangement of bunny bones, muscles, tissues, and fur? Moore provides 3 very specific reasons for why this level 7 is fundamentally distinct from level 6, doesn't he?
Yes, he does. And these 3 reasons are the bedrock of his entire theory. First, these specific mereological configurations have new names that refer to them, and they possess new functional properties that make up the functional structure of a new substance. We don't call a rabbit a spatio-temporally configured set of bones and fur. We call it a rabbit, and the functional properties belong to the whole. For example, a rabbit has the functional property of being the rabbit's heart or the rabbit's lungs. He uses a great analogy here. Think of a restaurant. A restaurant owner can analyze the organizational structure of their business, establishing functional roles like the server or the chef, completely prior to hiring any actual physical humans to fill those roles. The roles belong to the whole system. The second reason they are distinct is multiple composability. The persistence conditions of the higher-level whole are different from the parts. If one changes the back tire on his bicycle, the functional property of being one's bicycle's back wheel persists, even though the lower-level physical realizer has changed. A snake remains the exact same snake as it slithers through the grass, even though the specific spatio-temporal configuration of its physical cells changes with every millisecond of movement. And the third reason is singularity versus plurality. A specific mereological configuration is a singularity. It is one water molecule, or one rabbit. But the spatio-temporal configuration of the lower-level parts is a plurality. It is many cells, many atoms. Since one is not equal to many, the high-level substance, the singularity, must be a distinct substance from the plurality of its parts.
That distinction between singularity and plurality really sets the stage for his core metaphysical stance. So, if we accept that these level 7 wholes are novel, distinct substances, how does Moore categorize his specific brand of emergentism? Because in philosophy of mind, there are different flavors of emergentism, and Moore is very careful to define his view as Mereological Emergentism, which he aggressively contrasts with another popular view called supervenient emergentism. What is the fundamental difference here? And why does Moore think his Mereological version is vastly superior?
This is a vital distinction. Under Mereological Emergentism, the emergent phenomenon is the higher-level whole itself, that substantial unity we just talked about, along with its functional properties. Because the emergent is the actual higher-level whole, these functional properties have their own novel causal powers that can exert downward causation on the lower-level parts. The restaurant as a whole dictates where the chef stands and what the server does. Contrast this with supervenient emergentism. In the supervenient model, emergent properties are just abstract properties that supervene upon a base of lower-level physical properties. But Moore points out that supervenient emergentism runs directly into Jaegwon Kim's famous causal exclusion problem. If every physical event has a sufficient physical cause at the lower level, then any higher-level supervenient property is causally redundant. It is excluded from doing any real causal work. By arguing for Mereological Emergentism, Moore sidesteps the causal exclusion problem entirely. The higher-level whole is a distinct substance, a singularity, with functional properties that possess their own irreducible downward causal powers. It is not just a ghost hovering over the neurons, it is a structural reality that dictates how the parts operate.
That is a brilliant maneuver. By making the emergent entity a structural, functional whole rather than just a hovering property, he gives it real teeth. Now, let us apply this heavy metaphysical machinery to the actual problem of human agency. Moore is defending Agent-Causal Libertarianism, which essentially claims that free will requires two things: indeterminism, meaning the future is genuinely open and not predetermined by the past, and agential causation, meaning the agent themselves is the ultimate source of the choice. How exactly does Moore construct his model of the agent? He introduces this concept of the 4 agent-causal roles, which is where the paper gets incredibly detailed. How does he break down the mechanics of making a free choice?
Moore constructs the agent as an emergent whole whose parts include reasons, desires, and choices emerging from lower-level neural processes. But to make this work, he outlines a hybrid model. He includes some event-causal elements, but the magic happens in the 4 agent-causal roles. The first is the binding role. The agent binds together various reasons and desires into a unified psychological state. The second is the logical organizing role. The agent organizes these reasons logically, weighing their relative strengths. But then we hit a roadblock. If reasons just logically dictate the outcome, we are back to determinism. So, the third role is the indeterminism engendering role. When an agent faces conflicting reasons of relatively equal motivational force, they enter what Moore calls a torn state. He uses a great example. Imagine Alice is deciding where to eat. She has reasons to go to Subway, it's healthier, but she also has reasons to go to McDonald's, it tastes better. These reasons incline her, but they do not determine her choice. This torn state is objectively indeterminate. Moore brilliantly compares it to a quantum superposition in physics. Alice is suspended in a state of multiple open possibilities. Finally, to resolve this, we need the fourth role, the deciding role. Here, the agent acts essentially like a macroscopic measuring device in quantum mechanics. The agent's decision collapses the superposition. The agent, as a higher-level substantial unity, exercises downward causation to settle the torn state, actualizing one possibility and rendering the others physically impossible.
That quantum superposition analogy is incredibly helpful. It paints a picture of Alice standing on the street corner, literally embodying a state of physical indeterminacy until she, the emergent agent, collapses the wave function by choosing Subway. Now, Moore isn't the only philosopher trying to build an emergentist model of free will. In the paper, he spends a significant amount of time defending his model by comparing it to 2 other major contemporary thinkers, Timothy O'Connor and Juan Morales. Let's look at O'Connor first. O'Connor also defends Agent-Causal Emergentism, but Moore thinks O'Connor's model falls short in a few fatal ways. What is Moore's critique of O'Connor, specifically regarding how O'Connor views the functional level and the status of the agent?
Right. Moore respects O'Connor's work, but he identifies a critical flaw. For O'Connor, the functional level of the organism is merely conceptual. O'Connor treats the emergent property as what Moore would classify as an 8th-level entity in his framework, an emergent property that somehow arises from a complex microphysical structure, but O'Connor does not view the agent as a distinct substance. Because O'Connor's functional level is just conceptual, he ends up reducing the agent to the biological organism itself. Moore points out several severe difficulties with this. First, if the agent is just the biological organism, the causal role of the agent's reasons becomes dangerously unclear. Second, O'Connor's model risks positing the agent's choice as an uncaused cause, a sort of magical spark disconnected from the structural reality of the mind. Moore's solution is to insist that the agent is a distinct substance, a Mereological whole. and he anticipates the objection that this sounds like dualism. Moore famously quips in the paper that nobody worries about rabbit dualism. When we say a rabbit is a distinct substance from its constituent cells, no one accuses us of introducing a magical, non-physical rabbit soul. In the same way, saying the agent is a distinct higher-level substance from the neural network is not spooky dualism. It is just consistent Mereological Emergentism.
Nobody worries about rabbit dualism. That is a fantastic rhetorical counterpunch. It totally demystifies the concept of an emergent self. Okay, so that handles O'Connor. But then Moore shifts his sights to Juan Morales. Morales offers a different approach, one that tries to mathematically quantify how an agent intervenes in a physically indeterminate brain. Morales proposes what is known as a probability fixing model. He suggests that if the neural state is indeterminate, maybe there is a 50/50 chance of Alice choosing Subway or McDonald's. According to Morales, the agent's role is simply to step in and fix the probabilities, say, shifting it to a 0.6 probability for Subway and 0.4 for McDonald's. But Moore strongly rejects this. Why does Moore think the probability fixing model fails? And what does he offer instead?
Moore thinks the probability fixing model is deeply flawed because it falls victim to a couple of massive philosophical traps. The first is the reverse disappearing agent objection. If the agent only alters the probabilities but does not actually cause the final outcome, then at the exact moment of the decision, the agent effectively disappears from the causal chain. The second, and perhaps more devastating, is the luck objection. If Morales is right, and Alice just shifts the probability of choosing Subway to 60%, the actual final outcome, whether she actually walks into Subway, is still ultimately left up to chance, to a roll of the dice. If the final action is just a matter of statistical luck, you cannot hold Alice morally responsible for it. To solve this, Moore proposes his settling model. In Moore's settling model, the agent does not merely tweak the statistical probabilities. The agent decisively settles the outcome. The emergent whole, the agent, possesses what Moore calls surplus causal power. Because the agent is a distinct substance with downward causal authority over its neural parts, the agent's decision literally bridges the causal gap, collapsing the torn state and determinatively bringing about the choice. It is not luck, it is a gentle settlement.
The settling model is vastly more satisfying because it preserves the core intuition of moral responsibility. If I just roll weighted dice, it wasn't really my choice. If I settle the outcome, the ownership of the action rests with me. But this brings us to the final, and perhaps the most difficult, hurdle in the paper. We are talking about surplus causal power, downward causation, and agents collapsing torn states. Any strict physicalist listening to this is going to be pulling their hair out, screaming that this violates the foundational principles of physics. Section 6 of Moore's paper directly addresses this. How does Moore reconcile his Mereological Emergentism with the doctrine of physicalism? He breaks this down by analyzing two concepts, supervenience and completeness. Let's tackle supervenience first.
Yes, Moore knows he has to face the physicalists head-on. First, he redefines how we should look at supervenience. Traditional physicalism says the higher level is completely determined by the lower level. But Moore argues that in a Mereological Emergentist framework, the higher level whole is not completely determined by the lower level parts, precisely because of the phenomenon of multiple composability we discussed earlier, like the bicycle wheel or the slithering snake. The whole has a structural integrity and functional properties that govern the parts, not the other way around. But the real battleground is the principle of completeness. Completeness is the physicalist dogma that every physical event has a sufficient physical cause. Moore slices this concept into three distinct versions to show exactly where physicalism overreaches. First, he looks at basic completeness. He argues that strict deterministic completeness is empirically falsified by indeterminism itself, specifically quantum mechanics. If the universe has genuine ontological indeterminacy at the micro level, then strict physical completeness is already false, whether we are talking about free will or not.
Right. Physics itself has already abandoned the clockwork universe. So if basic completeness is out the window, what about the modified versions of it? Moore talks about completeness 2 and completeness 3. How does his settling model interact with these more nuanced physicalist constraints?
This is where Moore's rigorous structural logic pays off. Completeness 2 is the idea that the probabilities of all physical events are fixed entirely by prior physical conditions. But remember Moore's settling model? The agent, as a higher-level physical whole, exerts downward causation to settle the outcome. Because the agent is a real, substantial unity emerging from the physical world, the agent's causal power is a part of the total physical system. Therefore, completeness, too, is actually satisfied by the settling model. the physical universe, inclusive of emergent high-level structures, still balances its causal books. Finally, he addresses completeness. 3, which claims that higher-level mental states like reasons and desires can never be causally efficacious in a physical world. Moore says this principle is straight-up refuted by the causal theory of action. The causal theory of action is widely accepted in philosophy. It states that for an event to even be classified as a human action, it must be caused by the agent's reasons and desires. If you accept completeness, 3, you are essentially saying that human actions do not exist. Since that is absurd, completeness, 3 must be rejected.
That is a masterclass in philosophical dismantling. He doesn't just deny physicalism. He dissects its foundational axioms and shows how his emergentist model is either perfectly compatible with the reasonable versions of physicalism or correctly rejects the versions that are empirically or logically incoherent. It is an incredibly tight argument. So, to bring this all together, what is Moore's ultimate claim here? Because after reading through these layered mereological systems, the quantum superposition analogies, the settling model, and the defense against physicalism, you might expect him to take a victory lap and declare that he has definitively proven the existence of free will. But his conclusion is actually quite measured, isn't it?
Very measured, which is the mark of a careful philosopher. Moore's actual conclusion is stated very specifically. He writes that his aim is not to completely discount those other emergentist models, like O'Connor's or Morales's, but rather to provide another viable version that overcomes certain specific difficulties and strictly aligns with physicalism. He isn't claiming he has scientifically proved free will beyond a shadow of a doubt. What he has done is construct a logically coherent, metaphysically robust blueprint. He has shown that if you view nature through the lens of Mereological Emergentism, where wholes are distinct substances with real causal power over their parts, you can absolutely have an agent who stands at a crossroads in a genuinely torn state and who has the surplus causal power to settle that state, all without violating the credible boundaries of modern physics. It is an invitation to view ourselves not as helpless passengers in a deterministic vehicle, but as the emergent drivers of our own physical reality.
Emergent drivers of our own physical reality. I love that framing. Dwayne Moore's paper, Mereological Emergentism and Agent-Causal Free Will, really forces us to rethink the hierarchy of nature. It challenges the reductionist assumption that the smallest parts are the only things doing the real work and elevates the structural unity of the human agent to its rightful place as a genuine causal force in the universe. It is a dense read, but deeply rewarding for anyone trying to reconcile the physics of the brain with the undeniable reality of human choice. Thank you for walking through this incredibly complex labyrinth of an argument with me today. And to our listeners, next time you are standing torn between Subway and McDonald's, take a moment to appreciate the incredible, downward causal, mereologically emergent feat you are about to perform. Until next time, keep thinking deeply.